Tom came in this morning and said, Christ is risen. And I should have responded with, He is risen indeed. Okay? So let's practice that a little bit. Christ is risen. Risen indeed. Okay? It is a great thing that we celebrate today. And it's a thing that we celebrate, we talk about, we discuss. But there are a lot of things about it that we don't really discuss. And we're going to talk about some things today that I think is a little bit different than what you normally may hear on an Easter Sunday type of sermon. So I thought about different ways I could go about this. I could talk about why did Christ have to die to begin with? And because that's a question sometimes we don't answer too much in church. We talk about his death, we talk about his resurrection, but why did he have to die? So just to give you a little preview, that's what we're going to talk about next week, okay? But today, I wanted to talk about something different, and I have to tell you, we had a kind of a hard week this week. Kids out of school a few days. That didn't help with it all, too, but we had a lot of stressful things happen in our life. That's why I asked you guys to pray for us and pray for my family, and I want to thank you for praying for my family this week. And I want to say to you, continue to pray for us. In particular, pray for my health. I went to the doctor for a regular doctor's appointment Friday morning, and my blood pressure was extremely high. Put it this way, it was so high they gave me emergency medicine, okay? So it was that high, and it's related to stress. Now, since then, even that afternoon, it went down, and it's been down, but someone told me I need to really eat a brownie because it's really good. But the nutritionist told me Friday, right before lunch, that I can only have 1,800 calories a day, and she didn't put down snacks and desserts and things like. Well, she put snacks, but I had to eat things like a tomato or like 6 nuts or something like that. So pray for me because this was I have been pretty fat the last 10, 20 years of my life. And I went hiking this week and really could, make it up the first little flight of stairs and things like that. And then all this happening toward the end of the week. And it's a wake-up call for me. Nancy, I finally got the wake-up call, okay? So pray for me on that, but pray for our family. But so as all this is going on, part of the stress, too, was like, what am I going to preach about Sunday? What am I going to preach about Sunday? So I started reading different sermons and different things. And I got one idea from a sermon by a guy named Spurgeon. And Spurgeon was a pastor a couple hundred years ago, a very famous pastor. He's kind of the one that instituted what we call the seminary system, about people going and getting extra training that want to be pastors and missionaries and leaders and things like that. He was a pastor in England. And when he preached a sermon, his sermons are usually about an hour and a half or 2 hours long. I'm not going to preach his sermon. But he had one idea, and he said one thing in one of his sermons that really caught my attention. And what he said, and I'll talk a little bit about this again later, what he said was that when Jesus died, there was a whole lot of unbelief by those who followed him. Unbelief. And we're going to go through this a little bit in detail. But think about the story, those of you who know the stories. Okay, on Sunday, when Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome and the other women went to the tomb to embalm him, did they expect Jesus to be raised again? What about the disciples? They went into hiding. The apostles, they went into hiding. They were scared. We're going to look at some of them. Did they expect Jesus to be risen again? And many of you know the story of Thomas. Look at that story a little bit too. Thomas, who had heard the reports of the women, had heard the reports of the other apostles, the other disciples, that they have seen Jesus alive. And Thomas says, not until I see him will I believe. He believed, finally. But there was a lot of unbelief. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, about the struggle with unbelief in our lives, because I think even those of us who say we are Christians, at times, we get bombarded with so many things, we may struggle with a little bit of unbelief. So today's message is going to look at the unbelief of those people and how at a point they reached what I call a crisis of belief, where they had to make a decision. Would they accept Christ? Would they accept his resurrection? Would they put their faith in him? That's what I want us to look at today. So let's pop into this a little bit, okay? A common unbelief. Now, here's some of the things about the common unbelief, and some of the things that's striking about. To begin with, Jesus made it clearly known he would rise again. If you go through the Gospels, there's 10 different times it's reported. Now, some of those are repeats, okay? Different Gospels repeat the same story at the same time. But he told the disciples several different times, and the apostles, all those who listened to him, he would have to suffer, he would have to die, and he would rise again. So they should have known this. So here's some of the things, and I'm not going to read all 10 of them to you, but I just want to read one or two of them and just to emphasize it. So in Mark reports this, chapter 9, verses 30 and 31. He says, leaving that region, so the whole group of them left, they traveled through Galilee, and Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there because he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and to teach them. This was a critical moment. He wanted them to get this, okay? Sometimes when we're talking with the boys, we have to say, hey, shut off the TV. Hey, quit playing your games. Quit playing with your toys. Put it aside. Sit, listen to me. Look at me. Sometimes I'll even say to them because of all the distractions. And this is what Jesus was doing. He was taking them away to a place where he could really talk to them. And then here's what he said in verse 31. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. Could Jesus make it any more clear? No. Very, very clear. Now, they didn't understand. And sometimes I tell the boys things, and I say, am I clear? And I can look at their face, and I can tell they didn't understand. Okay? And I'm like, it should have been clear. It was plain, simple, straightforward. But they didn't understand at that point. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly. I like how the New Living Translation says, plainly, okay, simply. This is in Matthew. He would be killed, but on the third day, he'd be raised from the dead. Again, 10 different times in the Gospels, you see this happening. You see Jesus talking about this before he was killed on the cross. He let them know what was going to go on. He let them know what was going to happen. But they didn't understand what he was saying. However, but they didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. Now, there's many different ideas about why they were afraid. I think they were afraid because he said that, the Son of Man needs to be raised up and to be killed. And they've been following this guy. Remember, they had given up life. Andrew, Peter, John, James especially, they were fishermen. Their families depended on them, but they left that all behind to do what? To follow Jesus. Levi, or what we call him Matthew, what did he do? He had a really, really good job. He was a tax collector. That meant he had one of the better paying jobs around. He left that job to follow Jesus. Okay? So we have all these apostles, plus all the other disciples, because it wasn't just the 12 that were following around. There was hundreds of following around. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and all those, they were following. Mary and Martha, they were following him. They supported him. They did all sorts of things for him. And they hear this, and they don't want to hear it. I think that's why they were afraid to ask him, because they didn't want him to tell them plainly, this is what will happen. They kind of wanted to ignore it. Here's the thing. God will help you where you are, but you must choose to believe in him. See, we go back to that verse. They didn't understand what he was saying. Jesus knew at that point they didn't understand. But Jesus kept telling them again and again, because when the events happened, then he knew they would understand. He knew they would have unbelief. He knew that they would be scared, that they would run. But when the events happened, he said he knew they would begin to understand. God will help you where you are, but you must choose to believe in him. Then in verse 23 and 24, it says this. Jesus said to him, if you're able, okay? Now, what's this talking about? Here's what happened. There was a man that had a son that was demon-possessed, sick, okay? And the disciples, Jesus had been sending out the disciples himself, sent out the apostles already to go heal in his name, to do things in his name, to share the good news with people, to practice doing that because he knew one day he was going to leave, so they needed to practice. So he was a good mentor. He was a good boss. He encourages the people underneath him to take the responsibility to do it. They went out and they tried to heal this boy, and they couldn't heal the boy. So they brought him to Jesus, and Jesus, the father of the boy said, well, Jesus, your disciples couldn't heal him. You couldn't cast out these demons. He said, if you can you do it? And Jesus replies, if you are able, he's like, you're asking me if I'm able? Then he says this, all things are possible for the one that believes. Immediately the father of the boy cried out and said, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. See, there's times where I'm praying to God and I'm saying, God, I know this is what I should do, and I believe I should do that, and I trust I should do that, but help me to do it. And that's what this father was saying. I'm choosing to believe in you. I'm choosing to believe that you can, but yes, I have doubts. Yes, I have hesitations. Yes, I have all these things. But guess what? I'm asking you to help me in that. And that's okay. Jesus says, woohoo, great, It's like when one of the boys comes to me and says, Dad, I'm having hard help on my Chinese homework. Can you help me? They never say that. But sometimes they say, hey, Dad, I'm having trouble with my math. Can you help me? I think I did it right, but can you help me? And what they will do when they do that is they'll tell me what they did, and then I could either pat them on the back and say, good job, or I can either say, hey, you need to consider this part right here. You need to consider what's going on here. God says the same thing to us. God, I want to do it right. I want to believe in you. Help me. And God says, you bet. I'll help you. I'll teach you. I'll help you to grow in your unbelief. So we have this group of men and women that should have known better, okay? Jesus said, hey, I'm going to die on the cross. I'm going to be raised again 3 days later. They heard all that. They knew it all. They'd heard it over and over. They had seen Jesus. Think about some of the things they had seen. They've seen miracles. They've seen other things. They've been walking with Jesus. They've seen it all. And they should have known better when Jesus died on the cross that wasn't the final part. They should have known that 3 days later he would be raised. We have these women, and these women, sometimes we talk about the apostles and we don't talk about the women that followed Jesus enough, but the women were the backbone of Jesus' ministry for those 3 years. Mary and Martha provided needs. Martha especially was a wealthy woman. There were times in scriptures where we could see where they were actually in Martha's house when Jesus was teaching. Provided food, provided needs, provided the things that they needed. They supported, they helped them. So we have Mary and Martha, we have the other women, you have Mary, the mother of Jesus was even following this time. The rest of Jesus' family had some questions about him at this time, so they weren't supporting him, but you had all these people, and they were kind of a mosaic type of group of people, kind of like we are here. They came from all different regions. Remember, one of the things that was said about Jesus was he came from the region of he was a Nazarite. He was a Nazarene. So, well, can anything good come from there? Can anything good come from Nazareth? Some of these guys were from Nazareth. Some of them are well educated. Some of them had no education at all. Some of them were rich. Some were poor. Some were respectable. Being a fisherman was a respectable job. Being a tax collector was not a respectable job. Made you good money, but it wasn't respectable. So they came from all different walks of life, all different areas. And as a mosaic, they came together to follow Jesus. And the women are included in this too, and they're all there together, and they're all hearing all these things again. And yet, on that third day, not one of them that we know of, through the gospel accounts and through other writings, expected Jesus to raise from the dead. Not the women, not the men that we'll talk about later. So let's pick up the story with the women. Let's talk a little bit about the women, okay? Mark chapter 16, verse 1. Saturday evening, okay? Why Saturday evening? Because the Sabbath ran from Friday night sundown to Saturday sundown. Okay? That was the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, you couldn't buy anything, you couldn't do any work or anything else. Jesus was crucified on Friday. They took his body down. They put him into the tomb. So on Sunday morning was the first time that they will be able to go to put the embalming spices and everything onto his body. So on Saturday evening, they went after sundown, after the Sabbath ended. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome went and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. They didn't expect him to be risen. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. Okay? Now, they went to the tomb. They're walking to the tomb, and look what this next verse says. On the way, they were asking each other, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? So their focus, their expectations, their thoughts were that Jesus was still going to be in the tomb. And so their concerns was, how are we going to get into the tomb to care for his body? Because they loved him, they supported him, they wanted to see the best burial they could for him. Then verse 4, but as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. Okay? Now, I'm going through this last night and I'm thinking about this. I was like, at this point, something in their head should have went ding, 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 ding. Stone rolled away. Jesus said after 3 days he would raise again. According to Jewish customs and faith, it had been 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You know, sometimes we say, well, it's only been a day and a half, because that's the way we look at it. They looked at it as 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 3 days. Stones rolled away. Raise again. Jesus said he was going to come back to life. Hey, you remember Lazarus? Lazarus dead 4 days. He raised him to life. Hey, do you remember Naaman's son? Jesus brought him back to life. Hey, do you remember that? Jesus brought him back to life. Hey, maybe Jesus is alive. That's not what they thought. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were shocked. Why were they shocked? Well, first of all, if there's a guy glowing in white sitting in a tomb and I'm going into a dark tomb, I'm going to be shocked too. But they were also shocked because in the glow of that white angel sitting there, they could see that Jesus' body wasn't there. So they were shocked. What happened to Jesus? Who stole him? What did you do with him? Those type of questions probably came into their mind because they had expectations of finding Jesus. But here's the question. What are our expectations about Jesus? What are our expectations about God? See, even as believers, we have expectations. Things that we put on to God. Things that we say, God, this is how you need to be. But there are things that we need to consider. Are these really who God is? Some people have expectations that this is just all a fairy tale story. Some people don't think it could be true. I'm not going to go into it, but even through other historical documents, more proof that Jesus was alive, that he came back to life, than there is about most anything else during that time. There, he did come alive. What are your expectations? Look what happened in verse 6, Mark 16. But the angel said, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth crucified. He He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look at where they lay his body. And the angel saw in their faces the shock, the horror, the questions, maybe everything else. Maybe he knew that all those things were going on. And he says, hey, let me remind you what Jesus said. He said he was going to be raised 3 days. And he's not here. He's gone because he woke up, he got up, he left. Okay? He's not here. Why are you looking for him here? That's probably what I would have said. The angel is nicer than me. He said, hey, look where they laid his body. He says, look, it has happened. The things he had told you about. So again, you would think at this point the women would, oh, yay, praise Jesus, hallelujah. That's not what they did. They turned and they ran. The women fled from the tomb. Okay? They were scared. Now, I can really relate to, I would have been scared too. An angel and all this going on, I'd be like, ha, you okay? But they fled. They ran from the tomb. They were trembling, bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. Okay? They should have been running around. They should have been running from the tomb, but they should have been running with excitement and shouting, hey, guess what happened? Guess what happened? Just like the shepherds did when Jesus was born. They should have been running, sharing with people. Jesus is alive. He is risen. Oh, come on now. He is risen. He is risen indeed. All right, yeah, they should have been shouting all those things and celebrating, but they were scared. They didn't know what to say. Hey, did we have some bad, matzah this morning or something? There's something wrong with our brains? Is something going on? They briefly, notice it says they briefly reported all this to Peter and his companions. To me, that says they probably didn't say all those things we just read. Oh, yeah, we went to the tomb and Jesus wasn't there. They briefly reported what he said. Common unbelief. They should have known better. We have the women, but then we also had the disciples or the apostles. And the disciple, I put the disciples, not just the apostles, because like I said, there was many more than just at this point, the 11 that were closely following him. But those are who we're going to talk about. But there were many other people who followed Jesus for some time. Okay? Now, this is out of John chapter 20, and John reports this. She, Mary Magdalene, remember one of the women, ran and found Simon Peter. Remember the one that they briefly told about. And the other disciple, who was John. John never referred to himself in his own writings. He always called himself the other disciple. A few other things. The one whom Jesus loved. She said, they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. What about the angel? What about the rock being rolled away? What about seeing his burial clothes there? Because they saw that. They didn't mention any of that. In other words, they still hadn't got it themselves. Jesus' body has been stolen. All those bad people stealing it. So what happened? Look at this. Luke says this. The women rushed back from the tomb to tell the 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. So these women, they saw this. They ran back. Now here's the question for me. Where were the disciples? Where were the apostles at all this time? Scripture actually says they were hidden away in a room because they were afraid. They were scared about what might happen. Jesus was gone. Would they be next? Jesus was gone. What would happen to their following, their group? What would happen to them? Peter himself was dealing with the fact that he denied Jesus 3 times, just 2 nights before. What were those things? Why were they hiding? Why were they not anticipating that Jesus would be rose again? Why were they not having vigil outside the grave, waiting for that stone to be rolled away so they could celebrate? Because they didn't expect Jesus. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, several other women that told the apostles what had happened. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it because they had lost all hope. They didn't think about Jesus rising again. Their leader, the one they followed, the one they invested their lives in was gone. Their expectations was that it was all over. But we have two of them, Peter and John, jumped up and ran to the tomb to look. Stopping, he peered in and saw the empty linen wrap, and then he went home again, wondering what had happened. Is how Luke records. Now, Luke was not one of the apostles, but Luke was a doctor, and Luke wrote his gospel to give us the details and the things, and he interviewed different people and got different information. And so this probably came from Peter. Peter probably says to him, admits to him, say, hey, when I first ran into that tomb, I still didn't know what was going on. I still didn't know what was happening. I had vivid pictures of Jesus dying on the cross, the suffering of the crucifixion and all. And he said, I saw his body, how it was beaten, how it was bruised. I saw the soldiers pierce his side. I saw all those things happen. And to go in there and go look in the tomb and see that Jesus was gone, I didn't think about him being raised again at that point. I was confused. I was wondering what happened. And so these disciples, again, they just weren't getting it. But they should have been the ones who got it the most. But they had unbelief. They didn't believe that Jesus would rise again. Peter and the other disciple, John says, started out for the tomb. Again, this is John, Peter and John. They were both running. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Okay, now John's writing this, and John's writing about himself. I think he's bragging a little bit. I'm faster than Peter. Okay, but he runs there, and he gets there first, and he looks into the tomb. The next verse says he stopped. He looked in, and he saw the linen wrappings laying there, but he didn't go in. Why didn't he go in? Because, what's going on? What's happening? But Peter, Peter, if you read through the Gospels, and one thing, and you read through the rest of the New Testament and about Peter, one thing about Peter's kind of like, what we say, the bull in the china shop. He just barrels on. He doesn't care what happens, okay? He barrels on. He goes in. Simon Peter arrived and went inside, okay? He's just like, get out of my way, and he goes inside. He noticed the linen wrappings laying there, while the cloth that covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. See, that would be odd. If you're going to steal a body, why would you leave the linen wrappings there? You wouldn't. You would just take it all. And then the other thing about it was the head wrapping was folded up nicely and set down apart. Someone took their time to do this. It wasn't done in a hurry. And so Peter is confused. He's wondering what's going on. He's thinking about it. He's noticing that. And John then gets a little bit brave because, Peter went in. So John's, okay, I'm going into, I can look in there. I can see he's not there, but I got to go see some more. So he goes on. And I'll just tell you this, and then we'll go on with the rest of it because I'm going to say this later. But John goes in, and he sees the same thing, and it says that John believed. It doesn't say what he believed. The indication is that John finally figured it out. He looked and saw that Jesus' body was gone. Jesus said, after 3 days, I will rise again. When we have uncommon belief, we look and we see that Jesus clearly declared that he would rise again. We look at and see that they should have known better. All their experiences, everything, even what Jesus said, all these things should have told them to be there on that tomb on that morning, to be celebrating, to be ready because Jesus is going to come walking out of it, but they weren't there. And then they were all faced with a crisis of belief. Peter looking into the tomb, having confusion, thinking about what's going on. John going in and saying, hey, what do I need to do? What do I need to think about? And when we have a crisis of belief, there's a couple things that happens. First of all, it causes us to decide what we really believe about God. We have a health crisis. We have a financial crisis. We have a relationship crisis. We have an employment crisis. We have whatever crisis. And if we're truly following God, it often makes us think, what do we believe about God? Do I really trust that God can handle this in my life? Do I really trust the direction that God is taking me in my life? Then here's the verse about John. Then the disciple, John, who reached the tomb first, went in. He saw and he believed. For until then, they hadn't understood the scriptures that Jesus said he must rise from the dead. Notice it says until then. That's why I think what he saw and he believed is he remembered what Jesus said. And he began to understand what he didn't understand when Jesus reported. Jesus must die. He had a crisis. He saw, he made the instant choice to believe. One of the 12 disciples, named Thomas, or nicknamed the twin, he was not with the others when Jesus came. Now it says he went with the others when Jesus came because this is actually probably several weeks later. And what happened was at that morning at the grave, Mary Magdalene actually went back, other people went back, and Jesus started appearing to people, okay? Mary is crying at the grave and sad because she still thinks someone stole the body, and Jesus calls out to her and says, Mary, and she looks and she starts talking to him, and Jesus repeats it. He calls it a couple of times, and she finally dawns on it. She finally looks at him and is like, it's Jesus. It's excited. The disciples were faced with the same thing. Peter and John probably went back and reported to the rest of the disciples, and they were celebrating things, and Jesus appears to them in that hidden room, in that locked hidden room. He just appears to them and talks with them. There were two men that were walking from there to Emmaus, to a city called Emmaus, and as they're walking along the road, a man came and joined them and started teaching them about the scriptures and teaching them about the Messiah. And they finally realized that this man who's teaching them is Jesus, is the risen Jesus, the Messiah. And so he appears to many different people, but Thomas himself hasn't seen him yet. And so Thomas, he hasn't had his crisis of belief yet, his moment. He's heard the stories. Again, he should have known better. Come on, think about it. Guys people you've hung out for the last 3 years and you really trust your life and everything else tell you something happened, are you going to say, Junda? You're going to say, really? Really? That really happened? Really? Jesus said, oh, come on, you're just pulling my leg. He's not really alive. This is Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas a lot, okay? He really doubted what was going on, but all these people were telling him things. And sometimes when we're faced with the gospel and we're faced with Christianity, we're faced with trusting Jesus, sometimes maybe we don't say it out loud, but inside we say, really? God, do I really need to trust you on this? So Thomas, he wasn't with the others when Jesus came. And they told him, we have seen the Lord. I shook Jesus' hand. And Jesus and I had some fish together because, Jesus likes fish. Jesus talked to us about this. He explained to us again about him being raising again. Thomas replied, but I won't believe until I see the nail wounds in his hands, until I put my fingers into them and place my hands into the wound in his side. Thomas was a sick dude, okay? But his point was he was having a hard time believing. He wanted to see for himself. And he may have been thinking, God, what's the matter? You don't like me? You show yourself to everybody else, but not to me? I don't know what was going on in his mind. But there's Thomas saying this, and guess what happens? Jesus appears. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer, but believe. Thomas was having his crisis of belief. I said, hey, until I do this, and then Jesus appears in front of him just right after that and says, okay, do it. Jesus says, choose me. Choose to believe in me. What did Thomas do? He didn't stick his fingers in his side or anything else. He immediately cried out, my Lord and my God. He believed. His crisis of belief. He believed right then at that moment. This is what it's all about. A crisis of belief causes us to decide what we really believe about God. And it also leads us to take action that demonstrates our faith. Up until this point, the apostles, the disciples, everybody just sat around, hiding, scared. But you read through the rest of the stories of the New Testament. You read through the gospel accounts and even what happened just shortly after this. But you read through Acts, you read through Romans and everything. What do we know? They were in prison. They were beaten. They were stoned. They were outcast. They were ridiculed. They were, even ordered not to speak about Jesus. Peter himself even was crucified. Legend is upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to be crucified like Christ. John lived to the ripe old age, but his brother, his twin brother James, was executed very shortly after this. Why were they willing to do that? Because when you have a crisis of belief and you say, I believe, and you really truly believe in God, then you're willing to take action about it. You're willing to go and to share with others. And I think when John and Peter came back from that gravesite, and I think when John went in and he saw and he believed, and he started talking to Peter, and Peter immediately probably believed too, when they went back and told the rest of the apostles and disciples, it wasn't that, yeah, Mary was right. Somebody stole Jesus' body. It was just, guys, you can't believe what's going on. You can't believe this. You got to go see for yourself. Go see for yourself. Because they were so excited about what happened, they were willing to do anything to share the gospel about Jesus, who he was. Verse 29, going back to the story of Thomas. Jesus says this, Thomas, you believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. See, here's the thing. Jesus knows it's hard for us. Whether you are a believer or not, whether you have accepted Christ, if you put your faith in him or not, he knows it's difficult. He knows we're faced with things all the time, that we're faced with decisions in our own life that's hard for us to trust him. He knows that there's things in this world all around us that are trying to get us not to believe in Jesus, not to trust in him. And he said, Thomas, you saw, you're blessed. But it's hard for the rest of those following to believe. And I like how John ends this chapter 20. He ends this chapter 20 by saying this. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. So he said, hey, this whole book of John, chapters 1 through 20, all the things I've shared with you, all the things that are there are to help you see who Jesus is so that you can choose to believe in him. Verse 31 says, but these are recorded that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Because John had a relationship with Jesus. He said, I want you to have that same relationship. I want you to be able to believe in who Jesus is. John would probably even say to you, if he was sitting to you, talking to you one-on-one, he'd say, don't have the unbelief that I had after the cross. Have the belief that I had after I saw Jesus raised. What he would say. I think that's what the rest of them would say too. We know that Jesus met with many people. Scripture says that at one point even over 500 people saw him. There are other documents other than the Bible saying that this is true. But it doesn't come down to what's written in the Bible. It doesn't come down to what's written in other documents. What it comes down to, will you choose to believe in Jesus? Uncommon belief. They heard what Jesus taught. They saw all the things. They should have known better. They reached that crisis of belief. They chose to believe. And because they chose to believe, millions upon millions of people this weekend celebrating risen Christ. Millions upon millions of people throughout history have said, I will believe in Jesus. Some have given their lives. Some have lived lives that are grand lives in our estimation. Have chose to follow Christ. So the question is, are we willing to follow Christ? If you want to follow Christ and you don't think you've ever made a personal decision to follow him, then simply tell him that. Look what Romans say. Paul wrote this in Romans. Remember, Paul was a man who persecuted the church to begin with. He didn't like Christianity. He didn't like Christian believers. He came to Christ, and he said this: if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For it's believing in your heart that you're made right with God, and it's by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. God says, your choice. Will you believe in me? If you haven't, then maybe today's the day. And I like to tell people, just go to God in your own words. Say a prayer to God. You can do it quietly. You can do it out loud. Just, dear God, I'm like that man with the demon-possessed boys. I want to believe. I need help in my belief. I'm telling you right now, I'm putting my trust in you. I'm choosing to believe in you. I'm choosing to believe you are who you say you are. I'm choosing to believe that you, Jesus, were raised from the dead. Help me to learn more about you. Put it in your own words. Tell God about it. He will meet you where you are and take you from that point. Perhaps you're just in a place in life where you're just having doubts about who God is. When I was young, I grew up in a church, and I accepted Christ. I told God I believed in him when I was really young. But I went through a period of time where I doubted. I did as I believed in. Was it real or not real? Maybe you're in that point. Then maybe that's your crisis of belief right now. God just says to you, hey, I'll help you. I'll be there for you. Maybe it's just the fact that you feel worn out, you feel discouraged, maybe beaten down simply by life. Maybe you just need to go to God and say, God, other things got in the way. Right now, I'm choosing. You want to say re-solidify your belief, or you're choosing just to recommit your life, that's okay. But I'm choosing now to say that, God, I'm going to search you out, trust you in all things. David said this. This is David late in his life. Well, not late in his life, midlife. Remember David when he was a teenager, God anointed him king because he said he had a heart for God. And David wrote this in Psalms 51. He said this: create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. And make me willing to obey you. David understood that we would go through times where we just need to renew ourselves, re-energize ourselves with God. Not that we lost what we had before, but we lost that feeling. So maybe that needs to be your prayer today if you're a believer, that God will create in you a clean heart. That you're committing to him to obey him again and to trust him. Go to God in prayer. Before we pray, we just believe that Jesus is God and man. Believe that he died on the cross for our sin. We'll talk about why next week. We believe that he rose again, that he's alive today, And he did all this to bring us to God, so that we had a pathway to God, so that we could join God's family. Father, I know many times in my own life, maybe in my head I believe, but maybe in my heart has doubts. So, Father, for me right now, I'm asking you to do as we just read what David said in Psalms, to create in me a clean heart. Father, to renew a steadfast spirit within me, a spirit that trusts in you, that it's obedient to you, that follows you. Father, thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for loving each of us so much that you're willing to send Jesus to die. Father, that he died on the cross for my sin, but the victory was won, not on the cross. And he rose again. That's when he conquered sin and death. That's when he opened. So I thank you for that. And Father, no matter where we are today in our relationships with you, Father, whether there are some here who don't know you, I pray that you will use these words that we talked about this morning, not my words, but your words. Father, to tug at them and to let them know you are the one true God, and to help them to choose to believe in you. Father, for those of us that say we are Christians, those of us that placed our faith, our belief in you before, help us to take those steps forward. Share your love with others. Live love out in our lives. In Christ's name we pray. Worship team's going to come up and we're going to sing a song, Mighty to Save, because it is only by God's power that all this was possible to happen. So we're going to sing Mighty to Save. You can stand up then as we sing together.